Good morning, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us. We're going to wait just another minute or two to let everybody load in from the waiting room, and then we'll get started. All right. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Charting a Course, Navigating Towards Influential Pandemic Era Data and Research Insights. I'm Megan Combe, Executive Director of the Boston University Wheelock Educational Policy Center, and I'm honored to get to open today's convening. In a moment, I'll provide some details about the day and introduce you to our keynote speaker for the morning. But I thought it might be helpful to ground today's conversation in our why for organizing this event. To do this, I want to start by sharing a short personal story. I'm actually a relatively new addition to the BU Wheelock community, having just left the Massachusetts Department of Elementary and Secondary Education as Director of Educator Effectiveness in January of this year. Over the course of my tenure as a state policymaker, I was fortunate to have a robust, policy-focused research portfolio as part of my toolkit in managing change and supporting the field in the state. But when the pandemic hit in March of 2020 and everything shut down, we had far more questions than we did answers for some of the urgent decisions that needed to be made. So for instance, what do you do about a backlog of people who were about to or were planning on becoming teachers for the following year, but could no longer complete requirements or take licensure tests? Do we waive those requirements, keep some, not others in place? Which ones? Why? The last thing that I wanted to do was create a teacher shortage at a time when kids were likely to need more expert support, not less. But there were also risks associated with totally dismantling a set of policies that our existing research base suggested that, at least in some ways, we're controlling for elements of quality within our schools. So what to do? Ultimately, the conditions associated with COVID-19 provided an opportunity for us to make a move I would have never thought possible politically under normal circumstances. For the period of pandemic, the state of Massachusetts waived almost all licensure requirements for any incoming teacher. Research did not drive this decision. Facts and needs on the ground did. But in creating this new emergency certification, we also opened up a whole new set of possible questions that we could answer that we couldn't previously. And so now, in addition to having stymied fears of immediate shortages in our educator pipeline, we also have the chance to study and to learn something, and hopefully, in an ideal world, make the post-pandemic system better than it was before. In many ways, this is what today's conversation is about. And this is just one example. I'm sure every education leader or teacher in the country has similar tales to tell. So as we thought about sharing some of the research insights that our WEPIC faculty have helped to collect over the last 18 months, we also knew that setting a course for what could be in the years ahead was a necessary part of the conversation. At WEPIC, we believe in the power of research to influence the public good and to disrupt systems of inequities that have for too long shaped the experiences of students and families in our schools. We also believe that this work is at its best when the research is co-constructed between researchers and practitioners. Today's sessions are designed to situate those two roles side by side with one another so that we can talk together about the opportunities and challenges of making the most of this unprecedented disruption. In particular, the COVID-19 pandemic has both illuminated and exacerbated the deep and systemic inequities that exist within our society, particularly along the lines of race. Students of color have been historically and chronically underserved within our schools and other social systems. And as we think today about organizing and facilitating learning differently in order to bring out the brilliance and joy of all of our students, so too must we re-examine how we engage in data and research work on their behalf. And that brings me to the focus of our keynote speaker this morning. I'll introduce Heather in more detail in a minute, but Heather Krause is a data scientist and founder and CEO of the organization We All Count. We All Count is an organization Heather created because she saw both the power of data to reveal injustices and provide solutions, but also the harm it can do to people and communities it purports to serve. There's no better frame for our conversation about data and research insights necessary in education right now than this one, where our intentions are usually good, but our outcomes have persistently and continue to be exposing vast inequities for students. If we want to change the system, we need to think about the system differently, and Heather is here this morning to help us start to do that. Before I turn things over to her, I want to make a few logistical notes about the day. First, following this keynote session, we're offering 2 concurrent breakouts that will aim to be generative, both in terms of the current insights we've collected and in hearing from policymakers and practitioners who've been on the front lines for the past 2 years leading through the pandemic. One of these breakouts will focus on teachers and the other on students. At the close of this session, I'll include some more details both about these sessions themselves to make a choice about which one to attend, as well as details about how to log on to those sessions. And finally, our closing panel, which will happen between 1 and 2 o'clock this afternoon, will engage education leaders with perspectives and responsibilities across multiple dimensions and seek to have an even broader conversation, both stepping back and looking forward in order to talk about what's ahead. In all of today's sessions, we will be recording and sharing the videos and event materials with participants after the event. We also hope to encourage you to have this conversation along with us. Please use the chat function to weigh in on conversations. I can see that some of you are already doing that, and I really appreciate it. We might not be able to respond to each of those messages, but the chats will be saved and analyzed along with the panelists' remarks in order to help summarize major themes and takeaways from today's discussion. If, on the other hand, you have a question for the panelists or presenters, we'd encourage you to use the Q&A feature also in your Zoom bar. Those questions will be actively monitored and will be shared with moderators at the end of each session where we've blocked off time for audience Q&A. Finally, we really do hope that this is a collective and dynamic discussion, both one that happens within the event itself today, but also extends after the event and outside of it. If you're someone who's active on social media, we invite you to tweet throughout the event using the hashtag #ChartingACourse. All right, so without further ado, let me officially welcome Heather Krause to the screen, who will now take over our screen sharing responsibility and lead us off on our equity-centered research endeavor journey for the day. I want to thank you again for being here with us and thank Heather for helping to frame and center our conversation this morning. Heather.
Hi, Megan. Hi, everyone at the conference today. Thank you so much for having me, and thank you for that lovely introduction. And I've been looking forward to this quite a lot. It's such an important topic, especially in educational research right now. And I'm really grateful that you all joined us today. And like Megan said, feel free to put your questions, your comments, your observations into the chat or into the Q&A as I share my slides, because while I'm probably not going to stop and answer the questions as they come in, I am for sure going to make sure that we take time at the end of our hour together today to do our best to get to your questions. And sometimes it's good if you can just ask them in real time. So again, thank you for having me. I am a mathematical statistician. I'm coming to you today from Toronto, so not too far away from Boston. And I grew up in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. So I spent lots of time visiting Boston as a young child and in school. And I'm here to talk to you today about this idea that quantitative data is objective, that quantitative evidence is unbiased, and that if we can just follow the kind of recipes that we've all been taught, we will have evidence, research, studies that will help us understand how to spend our money, how to help educate young people, how to deploy staff, how to make decisions about accreditation, that quantitative data can help us do this by the fact that it's objective. And as Megan mentioned in the introduction, I very much believe in the power and the value of quantitative data, but I have way too much experience in the field to believe that data or quantitative research is objective, in the sense that if it is true that if we work very, very hard and we're attentive, we can get to a place where the data doesn't lie. But that only then opens up the next question, which is, whose truth does this data tell? And there are many, many, many examples that I could share with you from my decades of doing research and being a mathematical statistician all over the world that led me to understand that the idea that data is objective is a very serious equity issue that we in the research and evidence generation world need to come to terms with. And I'm going to share with you today a couple of examples. So I work with lots of different governments around the world, and one of them in the United States was doing some anti-poverty work, and they wanted to know, is our project a success? So I used the data that they had and made them a chart like this that shows that before the project, the average monthly income in the community was about $800. And then after, it was about $1,300. However, because I visited this area to kind of ground truth the data that we had, my team and I were really aware that there were very distinct neighborhoods within the community that this project was occurring in, and that our data could be used to understand what was going on in neighborhoods. When we do that, we can see that every neighborhood is not having the same experience of this project. If you're in this zip code number 1, this dark blue line, your income basically doubled on average. And if you're in zip code number 3, this light blue line, it's very likely that maybe your income didn't change at all. Looking at the data this way, of course, highlights another issue, which is the income inequality gap. The data can tell us a lot about the income inequality gap. It was about $200 before the project and about $1,100 after the project. So is this project a success, is what this government hired us to tell them. And of course, the answer to that relies entirely on who is in a position of power to define success. So if we want to define success as the average community income, yeah, this project was a good success. If we want to define success as the distribution of income throughout communities, this project was a success for some people, not so much for other people. If our definition of success is to reduce income inequality, this project was a gigantic disaster. And what's important here to remember is that none of these definitions of success is inherently more equitable. This is all all these calculations are made with the same data, and they're all mathematically rigorous. The equity issue here is really who gets to define success. And this isn't just a math problem. It is a math problem, but it's not only a math problem. It's also a human problem, because one of the things we're really seeing is a growing mistrust in science and in evidence. And one of the drivers of that is that people are getting tired of seeing their data used to report results that don't reflect their lived experiences. And this is because there is absolutely always a lived experience that's being prioritized when we're conducting quantitative work. I'm going to show you a really simple example here. Let's pretend we have a little teeny tiny school that has 3 classrooms. Classroom A has 3 students in it. Classroom B has 6 students in it. And classroom C has 9 students in it. We want to know what's the average number of students in this per classroom in this school. What's the average number of students across these 3 classrooms? This is fairly basic math. You don't need an advanced degree to do this math. If you look at this math and you say that the average number of students in a classroom in this school is 6, you are correct. If you say that the average number of students in a classroom in this school is 7, you are also correct. There are at least 2 correct answers to this question, and it depends on whose lived experience you are centering or prioritizing. If we want to prioritize the lived experience of teachers, we go into classroom A and we ask this teacher, how many students are in your classroom? That teacher says 3. If we go into classroom B and we ask this teacher, how many students are in your classroom? This teacher says 6. We go into classroom C and we say to this teacher, how many students are in your classroom? That teacher says 9. We add up the 3, the 6, and the 9, and we get 18. We divide by the 3 perspectives, the 3 teachers, and we get 6. However, if we're doing educational research, we might want to center the lived experiences of the students. We go into classroom A and we say to the first student we come to, how many students are in your classroom? That student says 3. And we go to the second student in classroom A. That student says there are 3 students in my classroom. We go to the third student in classroom A and that student says there are 3 students in my classroom. And we go to classroom B. We ask the first student we come to. That student says there are 6 students in my classroom. All the other students in classroom B also say there are 6 students in my classroom. And then we get to classroom C, where all the students correctly say that there are 9 students in their classroom. We do the math in the exact same way. We add up the responses. We divide the number of responses by the number of perspectives, and we get 7. So there are at least 2 correct answers to what is the average classroom size here, depending on whose lived experience we are centering. And this is true for very, very basic math, and it's true for very, very complex math. And this is where the power to embed equity in data science exists. It's in the choices. We think that data science is like this, or research generation is like this. We choose a question. Then we collect objective data, do an objective analysis, get some objective results, and make an objective decision. That's how we like to think that unbiased evidence is generated. However, many of you, if not all of you, either create research or make decisions based on research or consume research. You know that it looks a lot more like this. There are dozens and dozens and dozens of choices that are made at every single step along the research generation process. And each one of those choices prioritizes a certain lived experience, prioritizes a certain worldview. And so how we make these choices is how we embed equity into the quantitative work that we do. So I'm going to share a couple of places where, especially in education research, we often make choices that can help us achieve the equity goals that we have. Now, sometimes people come to me and say, what are our equity goals? What should our equity goals be? And that isn't a question for me. That's a question for you or your team, because of course, whose lived experience you want to prioritize, and what operational definition of equity you want to embed is going to vary. It's going to vary from context to context. It's going to vary from project to project. And so I'm going to show you some ways to make the choices that you make every day in working with data align with whatever your particular equity goal is. The first thing we're going to look at is research questions, because framing research questions is one of the most powerful things that we do in data science. And when we're thinking about equity in a research question, the two things we want to think about are, where is the onus to change, and what's the definition of success? And how are those two questions aligned with our equity goals? So I'm going to share with you an example that comes from real life. We're working with a school district in Texas that is working extremely hard to realign the way it uses data, the way it understands data, and the way it communicates data to be more anti-racist. They're trying to get their equity issues, their racial issues, their colonial issues out of the way that they use data in this school district. And one of the things they're doing in this school district is several different programs and interventions to improve school climate, improve student success. So the research and evaluation team in this district are charged with figuring out how this is going. So the research question that they started with was, is the intervention effective in bringing the Black, Indigenous, and Hispanic male dropout rates in line with the white male students? Which of our two interventions are working best? So that was their well-intentioned research question. They wanted to understand, is this changing the experience of Black, Indigenous, and Hispanic young men in our school? However, they do what many, many, many people do, which is they accidentally put the onus to change when framing a research question on the very people who are most likely marginalized and oppressed. So where is the onus to change in this research question? It's on the behavior of Black, Indigenous, and Hispanic young men. The onus to change is on the behavior of the very people that we think are marginalized. And what's the definition of success? Closing that gap between young men of color and white young men. So the definition of success is getting the behavior of young men of color to come into line with the behavior of white male students, which is not aligned with the equity goals of this piece of research. So we worked with this research team for a while, and we came up with a new research question that can be done using the very same data sets and very similar models, but it frames the research differently. The new question is, how much are our interventions effective in removing the barriers that we put up to Black, Indigenous, and Hispanic boys remaining in school in our district? So we've now changed. Where's the onus to change? It's no longer on the young men of color. The onus to change is on barriers. So we're no longer implicitly saying, are we able through our program to change the behaviors of marginalized and oppressed people? But we're saying, can we through our program remove the barriers that exist to marginalized young men? And then our definition of success, remaining in school in our district. So rather than starting to behave like white young men, our definition of success is, can they achieve a goal that they themselves have told us that they have, which is to get an education in our school district. So reframing a research question through an equity lens can go a long way without having to renegotiate your grant or without having to collect all new data. It can go a long way towards aligning your research process with your equity goals. Okay, I'm just going to look at one or two more really quickly because I want to leave as much time as possible for questions. So What about this research question? Is standardized testing creating scores for Black students that are the same as for white students? So this is a really interesting way to change, to frame a research question. Well, where's the onus to change? It's kind of buried here. And this is also an issue when we're trying to frame research questions with an equity lens. We need to make sure that we include people or systems that need to change. And here is standardized testing creating scores. So standardized testing isn't a being with the ability to do anything. A person or a system needs to be included here instead of just standardized testing. And then, of course, the onus of success is the same here. Are Black students able to change their behaviors to be the same as white students? That is not usually in alignment with our equity goals. Is our project making LGBTQ plus students more comfortable in our school environment? Where's the onus to change? Yes, the feelings of LGBTQ plus students. Once you start assessing research questions through this lens, it is kind of shocking how many times a research question that's designed to support marginalized or oppressed people, it also expects those people to change, which is a bad habit. And it's also an issue of power dynamics. It's easiest to ask vulnerable and marginalized people to change. Definition of success here is really interesting. The definition of success here is LGBTQ plus students feeling more comfortable in school. And while that's a nice looking definition of success on the surface, once you start to really look into it, we realize that this is a definition of success that centers the priorities, the values of the administration and the researchers, because LGBTQ plus students in this school district have been oppressed and marginalized and bullied for a really long time. If we start to change that school environment, there's a lot of research that shows that comfort is not going to be, if you stop oppressing a person, the very first emotion they're going to experience is not comfort. The first couple of experiences are things like rage, sadness, depression. So expecting comfort as an outcome, while it seems good, doesn't center the lived experiences of LGBTQ plus students. It centers the experience of researchers and administration. Okay, second thing I'm going to talk to you about, other than research questions, is social identity data. And I'm just touching the surface here. I'm going to point you at the end to digital places to get a lot more information if you want to dive deep into any one of these pieces of storytelling I'm sharing today. If you are going to use social identity data, which I think you should, social identity data can go a long way into helping us achieve our equity goals. But you need to be able to answer 4 critical questions about your social identity data before you use it. For example, I see all the time reports that say 25% of our students are Black. That is a sentence that I can't make meaning from. 25% of students self-identified as Black. So who makes the selection? I'm starting to get a little bit more information here. I'm starting to know a little bit more about how this individual was put into the box that they're put into. They self-identified. But frankly, that word self-identified, as an equity research specialist, I'm aware that that word self-identified sometimes carries more weight than it should, because I want to know self-identified from what choices. So we're saying self-identified, this person put themselves into a category, but what categories were they given? That's where the real meat of the equity power is in social identity data. What categories were options? 25% of students self-identify as Black from a list of Black, Hispanic, white, mixed race, Asian, Indigenous, other, and prefer not to say. That tells me a lot, because sometimes the categories that they were given were like Black, white, other, which can really affect the percentages of people that will self-identify as what. Then the final thing, the really most, like the seat of power in social identity data, is who gets to define the categories, who gets to lay out the boxes that we're expecting people to sort them into. If you want me to understand and use and decide whether or not I want to amplify your findings, your research, I need to know all of this information. I need to know the information from all 4 boxes. 25% of our students are Black is not a sentence that has meaning. 25% of our students self-identified as Black from a list of Black, Hispanic, white, mixed race, Asian, Indigenous, other, and prefer not to say, created by the University Admissions Department in consultation with a student advisory panel, is a sentence that takes into account the social context, the system, the historical implications. This is a sentence that I can make meaning from. Okay. Last thing I'm going to talk to you about today is once you have that social identity data, how are you going to use it? And one of our recurring pieces of feedback that we get from communities that we work with all over the world is known as an asterisk. In that if you are going to use, there we go. If you are going to use our data, it is essential that you find a way to make meaning from our data. So we're working right now in the US with a network of food banks who, of course, much like yourselves, are going through tremendous structural changes due to the pandemic. And they want to know things like, are the new structures, the new delivery processes that we're putting into place, are they achieving equitable customer service levels? Are they working as well for white people as they are for other types of people? So doing a customer service survey, many of the respondents are self-identifying as white. Medium number of the respondents are self-identifying as Black. Small number are self-identifying as American Indian. Now, a habit might be to do something like when reporting out, the average customer service ranking for white people is 8 out of 10. For Black people is 6.5 out of 10. And for American Indian people is not statistically significant. We can't report. That is mathematically incorrect and a human problem. To say that a group of people's results are not statistically significant is mathematically incorrect. There is actually no way to test for the statistical significance of a sample size. Now, I am not saying that you should never say that something is not statistically significant. There are many tests for statistical significance that matter, that give you useful information that you should report. But whether or not a sample size is big enough to be meaningful is not one of those. Instead, we need to say, not that our results are not statistically significant, but our results contain uncertainty. The amount of certainty we have around the customer satisfaction level of American Indian people is wider than the level of certainty that we have around the customer satisfaction ratings of white people. Then, of course, we've now opened it up to the real question. Our results contain this type of uncertainty because blank. Our results contain more certainty about white people and less certainty about American Indian people because, and the truth is almost always because this is the way we chose to design our research. So you can see in terms of equities about power, the difference between saying we're not reporting American Indian customer satisfaction levels because their results are not statistically significant is very different than saying we're not reporting American Indian customer satisfaction results because the way that we designed our survey does not allow us to make meaningful information. Big difference from an equity perspective. Who is the onus on here? Second thing is that there are lots and lots of ways to make meaning from small sample sizes. And it is important that we as a research community find ways to make this meaning. You don't always have to report a point estimate. You can report ranges. You can report confidence intervals. And the more often these, the ranges. So let's say we're going to report ranges for our food insecurity customer satisfaction survey. Let's say we're going to say for our white identifying clients, the customer satisfaction level is between 7.5 and 8. And for our Black identifying clients, our customer satisfaction level is between 5.5 and 6.5. And for our American Indian identifying clients, the customer satisfaction level is between 4 and 7. That's a much, much broader confidence interval, and one that you might feel less comfortable reporting because you don't want to state plainly that that's the result of the project design, and B, you might be worried that people won't understand or will make decisions without realizing that that's a range. One of the ways to avoid that is, of course, to only report the range, to never report that point estimate. And the second thing to do is to think about in whose best interest is it to withhold these broad ranges. The more that we talk to communities who have been and still are being oppressed and marginalized, the more these communities do not align with this system of suppressing small sample size results. They understand that it is harder to report a range than a point estimate, but it still allows small communities to be included for the purpose of understanding how COVID's going, understanding how the food bank services are going, understanding how the education changes are going. Okay, last thing I'm going to show you is how easy it is, even with the very, very best intentions, to accidentally embed worldviews that we don't want to be amplifying when we're working with anything about data, from data collection to the funding of science to particular choices in the statistical analysis, and then very much to the way that we visualize and communicate data. You all work in education, so many of you have probably seen something very similar to this, where we're trying to illustrate the idea between what is equity and what is equality. And this is the first picture, 3 people of 3 different sizes trying to look over a fence. And the idea is that this is equality. Everybody gets a box. Doesn't work great because this tall person on the left could always see over the fence. They still can. Small person on the right still can't see over the fence. This is equity. Each person gets what they need. The tall person can still see over the fence, and the smallest person gets 2 boxes, and now they can see over the fence. Really, really common visual. And it was when we started Wheelock and started kind of digging in, reverse engineering every single part of the evidence generation process, that I started questioning every single thing I saw about whose worldview is being embedded here, and realizing that this kind of conventional illustration embeds a worldview that I really don't want to amplify. First of all, I'm very uncomfortable with the idea of using height to symbolize kind of individual value or potential, not because I don't believe that people are different heights, but because height is something that is individual and something that's very much influenced at birth. And I don't want to use that as an encoding for where somebody's starting, that it's like what they're born with. It's up to them. It's an individual thing. I think this is a much more realistic way to illustrate, to embed the lived experiences and the worldviews that I resonate with. I think people are all, born relatively equal, and what they find themselves in is very, very different social locations and looking at very, very different barriers. The idea that there's this one systemic barrier that we're all trying to get over, and some of us were born short and some of us are born tall, really perpetuates so many of the basic tenets of racism, sexism, homophobia. This is really where we're at. And the idea that we're going to achieve equity by handing down some boxes from on high and getting people more comfortable with systemic barriers is not at all what I want to amplify. I'm in alignment with the idea that we're going to achieve equity. We can grab hold of every tool we can find and actually level out that playing field and take down those barriers so that each of the people who are born with value can decide how they're going to move forward. And this is very, very true for anybody who has the ability to grab onto a tool that has to do with data. And the first thing that you can do starting right now, starting today, is recognize that you are making subjective human choices in your data work. This does not mean that your work is not scientific, or that it's not rigorous, or that it's not reliable. It just means that there are many, many choices that are being made. Once you've realized the choices, then you want to start identifying them in a practical way in your work. The next time you sit down to write a research question, or to read a research report, or to make a decision about what you're going to do based on some kind of quantitative evidence, identify the choice points. And number 3, to the greatest extent possible, make choices around data that reflect the equity that you want to see. Align your quantitative research choices from how you're collecting data, to how you're analyzing data, to how you're communicating data. Align them with your equity values. This is the point in our kind of sector's history that we need to examine every element of the scientific process, every element of our research generation process, and ask ourselves, which of these elements are really, truly necessary for scientific rigor? And which of these elements are just somebody's preference or habit that's been handed down over decades, kind of accidentally or intentionally masquerading as necessary elements for scientific rigor, because we have both in the chain of knowledge, and it's incumbent on us right now to separate the two. Number 4, expand the group of people who get to make meaningful choices about data. I very much do believe that the diversity of people involved in creating your research makes a difference. I don't think it's enough to only have diverse people making choices, especially if we still haven't examined kind of what the rules are around what gets to count as evidence, but it's an important element. Number 5, talk about the choices and stand by them. Rather than just standing behind some shield of scientific invulnerability, it's really important that we make the choices in our evidence generation processes transparent, so that anybody that we're expecting to make decisions, policies, practices based on our research can understand what lived experiences and worldviews were centered. If we're reporting average classroom size in a paper, we need to be transparent about how we did that calculation and what the social implications of that calculation are. And then, of course, 6, back to the top. Be ready to try and make even better choices next time. Equity is not a destination. I get asked all the time, can I please certify this piece of research as equitable? That isn't possible. Instead, it's a dynamic process of making better choices every time. So those are some things you can do right away. And then if you really want to dive deeper into these ideas, WeAllCount.com is kind of the digital home of the We All Count data equity community. I'm the one that's speaking to you today, but I'm certainly not the only person here at We All Count and in the broader We All Count community. There is actually a huge representation from the educational sector, from researchers who are embedded in local schools to people who, are at fancy institutions as, head educational effectiveness researchers, to people who fund educational research, to students and parents who are being impacted by educational research. So absolutely make yourself at home at weallcount.com. There's lots and lots and lots of pieces to read and tools to try. Make yourselves at home. And if you want to get in contact, hello at weallcount.com is where we can help you out and send you in whatever direction you need to go. That'll meet your needs. This is my Twitter at DataSyst. I would not recommend following me on Twitter. I am almost never on Twitter. So if you really want to get involved in WeAllCount, I suggest the website and the newsletter, which you can sign up to on the website, and then the email. But most importantly, thank you so much for having me today and allowing me to talk to such an interesting audience of people. And okay, I think I'm gonna look now. Megan, do you want to go through the questions, or do you want me to?
Yeah, we've got a couple that have come in, Heather, that I'll read to you, and then also I'll invite others that are on the call. There's been some active chat. I've been getting side texts and stuff about how inspiring and important your conversation today. So just first, thank you, Heather, for kind of helping us to create an important frame for the conversations that we're having, which is about how to set research questions that, as we move forward in our educational systems, really do center the lived experiences of students from an equity lens. So I really appreciate your time. So a couple questions while other people maybe take a minute to reflect on what you've said so far. The first is, and I'm just going to read it to you, says, what are your thoughts about comparing effect sizes? And by that, substantive significance between groups as opposed to statistical significance.
Absolutely. I'm a huge fan of effect sizes. Absolutely. That is a meaningful thing to say. What I'm really in the talking about making meaning from small sample sizes, I'm really making the point for how important it is from an equity perspective to find ways to convey knowledge and information back to the people who we selected to collect data from. And effect sizes is a great way to do that. Bayesian analysis, which isn't the only way to go at effect sizes, but Bayesian models are becoming really widely accessible. And I won't go into it because I know there's a wide range of technical interests on this call, but there are many, many ways to make meaning from small sample sizes, and effect size is a really great suggestion.
Great. So another one that came in, Dr. Heather, you have introduced your presentation by saying that numerical data in a quantitative research should be objective. If we let participants self-identify themselves, can we ensure that they are telling the truth?
Well, that's a great question. That's a whole afternoon we could spend together about, well, how would they yeah, that's such a good question. How can we be sure they're telling the truth? Of course we can't. There's no way, and no matter how you collect data, there's no way that you can be sure that somebody's telling the truth. But the important part here isn't, the important part here is the definition of the truth, right? So if we're collecting social identity data, if we want to know if somebody's racialized or not, first of all, what we really want to know is whether somebody's experienced racism or not the color of their skin. But putting that aside, assuming that we're going to use a proxy variable for racism, which is race, and there's lots and lots of equity problems with using proxy variables, especially around social identity data. But the difference between asking somebody about their racial identity and looking at their skin color and having somebody else decide their racial ethnicity is gigantic. We are measuring two entirely different things. If you ask somebody what their racial identity is, we are measuring their lived experience in relation to the boxes that you have supplied to them. And if somebody else is assigning them a race, we're not collecting data about that person. We're collecting data about the enumerator, which maybe is what you want. And if so, that's a genius way to do it.
Appreciate that. There's also some commentary in the chat that I think resonates with yours about whose truth.
Whose truth, right?
Are we identifying? So another question. I really appreciate your concept of equity in data projects from start to finish, and I'm wondering what advice you have for the consumers of the data projects. A sort of retroactive equity interrogation of someone else's choices, and how that might influence the decision making that happens.
Absolutely. I love that question. That question is so important. And that is exactly what we're trying to focus on when we make statements like the 4 pieces of information that you must have to use social identity data. That's an important rule of thumb for somebody who's collecting data, for somebody who's analyzing data, but it's also an important rule of thumb for somebody who's trying to make a decision based on a report. Is if they have told you that 25% of their students are Black, you have no idea what they mean. And so those are the 4 questions that you need to ask and either find out from whoever is giving you that research, or think twice before using that research. And I think if I didn't talk about it here, but we think of this like start to finish thing as the data equity framework. And you can find a lot more information on our website about the data equity framework. And the data equity framework does walk you through the questions that you want to ask as a researcher and the questions that you want to ask as a consumer about what happened at each step. How did this get funded? Who chose how to collect the data? What type of analysis was done? And I suggest you go there, but every single tool that we have can be kind of applied going forward as you build the piece of research, or applied going backwards as you're trying to understand, do I want to make decisions based on this research, or what is this research really saying?
And maybe a kind of connected question to that. The note about the small sample sizes to allow for an expansion of inclusion within the data reporting that you provided. Wondering if there's some tension around that inclusivity and the potential for results to be misleading or misinterpreted, or perhaps even ignored if the target audience doesn't adequately understand how to interpret something like the confidence intervals and what it means to have that kind of wider range. So if so, can you talk about how that tension and kind of weighing the benefits from a more complete reporting against the potential drawback of reporting results that appear to tell us more than what the data might actually provide?
Yeah, I do think that's a very important question. Thank you for asking it. And I think that there's a couple of different ways to think about it, depending on what your equity goals are, right? Like there isn't a rule of this is how you should always do it. But what I'm really saying is it's important to think about it, not just have some rule of thumb that if you don't have some magic number of people, you aren't going to make meaning. That's mostly what I'm saying. And in terms of that tension between inclusivity, representation, and confidence, we're actually just about to put out a tool that has 4 dials on it that help you kind of figure out what your level of confidence is, what your level of representation is, what your level of interpretability is, and find your ideal setting on each of those dials, and that will give you some guidance on how to deal with that tension, because that tension is real. But I need to really say that the lack of the general public is able to make much more sense of data than we think, especially if we make an effort to communicate it in a non-technical way. Absolutely. If you start talking about confidence intervals, people are going to stop listening. but there are so many other ways. There's so many other choices and how you can even just write a sentence, because people say, I don't have time to write a whole paragraph around every data point. And I think that that's a little bit intellectually dishonest. There are many, many ways that you can simply write a sentence. If your priority is to communicate usable data in a trustworthy way, I would challenge yourself to go at that question a little bit harder. And if it's not as fast or it doesn't make you as much money, those are equity issues. Time and money are equity issues. So if you're not willing, it's going to be very hard to embed equity in anything in our world without changing the way we do things, without who accrues value, right? Like I as a researcher might get a few less clicks on an article if it on an infographic or something, if it's more inclusive and doesn't talk about point estimates, but gives, a range. But marginalized and oppressed people might see themselves in it. So there are choices to be made.
Well, I appreciate that, Heather. And I think there's actually a couple of questions we're not going to be able to get to just because we're getting tight on time, that I think touch on this notion that there are systems of inequity that exist even in academia. So as people think about journal publications and peer review comments from editors and weighing the decisions that we're making relative to the current systems and infrastructures that exist and have been built up over time versus our own equity compass, which I think you've helped to kind of elevate over the course of this presentation.
Yes, and it's a very real issue. I have a good friend who's doing some great equity research, and there's a journal that wants to publish it, but they can't find any reviewers. And that's a problem, right? So a lot of the structures, a lot of times I get asked, how can I embed equity in my work while retaining the full benefit of the entire structure that I exist in? And I'm like, you probably can't, right? Because the structures have problems.
And that is a very perfect the have problems. If we're going to talk about anything today, I think that will be a resonant theme. And Heather, I'm going to kind of do some logistics for the remainder of our day today, but just want to say thank you again on behalf of the Wheelock Educational Policy Center and our participants on the call for joining us and helping to kind of create that orientation, help us think differently, and as you say in your 6th point, help us to make better choices moving forward.
Thank you for having me. I really enjoyed it.
Great. Okay, so just a couple of logistical closing items for those of you that are planning to join us throughout the rest of the day. As we close out this keynote session, the next session is going to start at 11:15. And here you have a choice about where to go. We're running concurrent sessions, one that is focused on teachers and one that is focused on students. In the teacher one, you'll get to hear about some research around turnover and attrition patterns and how teachers spent their time differently during the pandemic. And that session will be moderated by Maria Fenwick of Teachers Collaborative, feature panelist Stephen Zreich, who's superintendent of the Salem Public Schools, Katie Anthus, who's commissioner of education in Colorado, and Susan Moore Johnson, who's professor and founder of the Project on Next Generation of Teachers at Harvard. For that session, you can use the current Zoom link that you got in your registration and that you are in right now, and we'll be back on at 11:15. The other choice that you have is to hop over to a different Zoom link and talk about the impacts of the pandemic relative to students and centering their experiences. And here we'll have some insights around enrollment trends and shifts in bullying amidst the pandemic. This session will be moderated by Heather Johnson of EdVestors and feature panelists Jason Glass, who's the Commissioner of Education in Kentucky, Charles Granson, who's our Chief Equity Officer in the Boston Public Schools, and Carrie Rodriguez, who's the founder and president of National Parents Union. Again, for this session, I do want to note you'll need a different Zoom webinar link, and that link is both included here, and I'll drop it in the chat in a minute, It is also in the reminder email at the bottom that you got from Zoom this morning, and it's also on our website. So you should be able to find it in multiple places in order to get access to that session. If you plan to join us for our closing session, you'll come back onto this Zoom link, your original one from registration, and join us for a conversation that is really intended to look across the system from multiple perspectives, and think about kind of what those challenges and opportunities we should be pursuing research questions around moving forward. Lastly, I just want to say again, thank you so much for participating both in the chat, your Q&A, and with our speakers. All of the insights collected over the course of the day are going to be kind of summarized, hopefully, in a document that reflects themes and trends that we're hearing and are jumping out over the course of the day. This is being recorded, and it will be shared with anybody who's registered following the event, probably early next week. And if you're not joining us for the rest of the day, we appreciate your time and we'll look forward to seeing you again soon. Thank you so much.